All right. So on the line we have Dale McGowan, I hope. Are you still there?
I'm here.
Great. Dale McGowan is the editor and co-author of Parenting Beyond Belief and Raising Freethinkers, and author of the newly released Atheism for Dummies. He teaches non-religious parenting workshops across North America and is the founding executive director of the Foundation Beyond Belief, a humanist charitable organization. And in 2008, Dale was named Harvard Humanist of the Year and lives near Atlanta with his wife Becca and their 3 children. How are you doing today, Dale?
Real good. How about you guys?
Great.
Doing great. Glad to have you on the show.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this topic because Jen and I are the only parents who are regulars on the show, and we get email all the time asking for asking complicated questions about how to raise their kids, and I'm sure you know better than anyone that those aren't easy questions to answer.
Yeah.
So what inspired you to write a book about parenting?
Well, I was inspired by the need for it, mostly when my kids were young, especially when my firstborn was, getting to be 3 or 4. I started running into the issues and went looking for resources to answer some of the questions that I had, and found nothing, which was astonishing to me. I couldn't believe that there were 3 or 4 major titles out on Jewish parenting. There were scores of Christian parenting books.
17 gazillion Christian books.
Yeah, absolutely. Islamic parenting, the whole thing.
Right.
But I wasn't able to find anything. Well, and certainly secular parenting books. But that's not the same as specifically parenting from the non-religious perspective.
Right. So what would you say are the special challenges that needed to be addressed as far as raising kids when you're an unbeliever?
Well, there's really no end to the list, but it partly depends on what your own situation is. Some people, if you're living in the rural South, you're going to have a different set of issues from somebody living in Chicago or New York. Mm-hmm. But generally, one of the main issues that you have to deal with first is the question of whether you are raising atheists or if you're raising freethinkers. I think that's probably one of the clearest ways to put it. Okay. Once you decide that, a lot of the other issues start to clarify themselves. You can start to see how to get at them. Yeah. But once you sort of establish that, you move on to the question of religious extended family. Mm-hmm. That's one of the big ones that people deal with. How can you raise a child to make their own decisions in terms of worldview when the extended family they're in is primarily religious? That's probably the next big issue that people confront.
Yeah.
Well,
I was going to say, it's interesting because that's the thing I think that drives a lot of people to email us, is that they've got family members who are doing their best to indoctrinate the children over the parents' objections, or sometimes the parents are not completely open about their non-belief, and so as a result, the children are at risk of being indoctrinated, and the parents write to us saying, what do I do? How do I handle this?
That's right.
So what do you recommend in those kind of situations?
Well, one of the first things I recommend is that the parents should be open about their unbelief, at least to the child.
Right.
But once in a while I have somebody come to me and say, I'm so concerned, so worried about indoctrinating and avoiding that I haven't even told my child what I believe. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a mistake. I think you have to be forthright with it. You have to say, this is what I believe, but I want you to look at the evidence, look at various points of view. You are going to make up your own mind on this, and I will love you no less.
Right.
So that's a starting point. Beyond that, it's a matter of addressing it quite directly, especially with any relatives you have who are creating a direct pressure. If you have somebody who is literally, like you said, trying to indoctrinate the child, that's not okay. that's getting in the way of your own parental rights. It's certainly getting in the way of the rights of the child as well. So what you have to do is sit down and have a conversation with a relative who's doing this.
Right.
But there are ways to do it in a way that is not going to make the person defensive. It's not going to make them feel that it's a win-lose situation. And so I talk about this in the workshops very much.
That's interesting, because I usually advise people, it's your damn kid.
Yeah.
You tell your relatives what's what. But it sounds like you've got a more diplomatic solution on hand.
Well, it's one that it's based on the concept of nonviolent communication, which is something that Marshall Rosenberg and some others have spelled out. It's an extremely effective way to have a conversation that reduces tension between people by not setting up this win-lose dichotomy. In the process, you don't give anything up. I mean, I'm not saying go into this and go to the relative and say, okay, let's see how we can find a middle ground between letting the child think for themselves and having you scare them with hell. That's not, we're not looking for a middle ground there. What I'm looking for is an opportunity to say, this is the parenting that we have chosen to do with the child. Let's talk about ways that we can involve you in the child's religious education, let them know what you think, but ultimately we're going to have to come to an agreement that our child is going to make his or her mind up independently. And the way you do this is by honoring the person in whatever ways you can by saying things that are true. For example, if I were to go to my mother-in-law, who is quite lovely, frankly, she hasn't been a problem in this area, but if I went to her and said, I want to have this conversation with you because you're important to our family, and we want to have a good relationship with you and your grandchildren, and we know that the religious questions have been a concern to you, so we really wanted to sit down and address this directly. You empathize with the person. You don't say, what the hell's wrong with you? Why are you so concerned about this? You can say, I understand how you feel. I think if I were in your position, I might feel exactly the same. That allows the person to sort of open up and listen to what you have to say next. And then you say, my concern is that Jennifer is allowed to make up her own mind on this, but the only way she can do that is by hearing many points of view. And I would like to have an opportunity for her to sit down with you and me. We'll have a cup of hot chocolate, and I'd like you to share what you believe.
So you don't unloose them on the kid by themselves in an unmoderated environment.
That's the issue. That's exactly right. What you do is you sort of take the initiative and say, I want you to be able to talk to the child, but then you create this opportunity that circumvents the need for them to do it in a sneaky way.
Okay.
This is the sort of thing, I've talked to so many people who've tried this, and it has opened up the dialogue, it has reduced the tension, and it's put the child in a position to, well, one of the things you have to say, it's going to be okay for the child to ask whatever questions they want. That's a non-negotiable thing. And what the relative will very frequently do is be so grateful for being included in this situation that they will consent to that. Okay. And what comes through in terms of the long-term relationship, the family relationship after this discussion happens, is really an extraordinary thing. There can be a lot of cooperation where there had just been this sort of butting of heads. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it's amazing what it opens up.
Great. Do you deal much with parents in mixed marriages, basically?
Oh yes.
I actually saved an email that a caller sent, that somebody sent us a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it would be a good thing to read to you. May I?
Yeah, that'd be fine. Could I say something else first?
Oh, sure.
I'm actually getting a delayed echo that's quite loud, and it's hard for me to focus.
Okay. Hey, control room, get on that. And you don't have us streaming while you're calling, do you?
No.
Okay.
Okay, good.
All right. Well, I hope that it'll be fixed by the time I finish reading this, and then I guess a little later we'll get to your other book.
Okay.
Let's see. So this is Daniel writing in, and he says, I'm a parent of 3 young boys, ages 3 months to 4 years. I used to be an Orthodox Hasidic Jew, although I was raised in a fairly traditional secular Jewish home. I've been an atheist for 2.5 years now. My wife and our religious community where I live know I'm an atheist. I am open about my beliefs, but while I am with my family or in the community, I practice many Jewish rituals, such as wearing a yarmulke, keeping kosher, don't work on Sabbath and holidays, etc. Partly for my wife's sake, who is still an Orthodox Jew. And in part, I still do get some nostalgic pleasure from performing these things from time to time. My wife respects my views, but we are sending our kids to a private Jewish school. Right now, the younger two, are too young to understand the concept of God, while the oldest one gets the idea of God, basically, that God is invisible but everywhere and that he can do anything and is a good guy, and that's about the extent of it. How do you think a person in my situation should approach the idea of God with their kids, and when? My plan is basically to tell them that I don't believe in God when the subject comes up. So, for instance, if they ask me a question about God or his actions, or if they make a statement referring to God but request my opinion. I tried to gauge my son's understanding of concepts like pretend. He knows that when he is acting like a superhero or an animal, he's pretending. But when I ask him about movies or shows he sees and ask him things if he sees like dragons, fairies, etc. are real, or pretend, he insists they are real. I figured the time to reveal my doubt to him would be the time when he starts to understand that things he hears in stories and movies aren't always real and are sometimes pretend. Is that a good approach? Is there a better alternative in your opinion? I personally would rather not force my opinions on my children. I would answer questions on things and, if appropriate, give them my perspective, but I would like to teach them to think for themselves and to be inquisitive as far as I'm able. I know that my children are really young, but I would like to think about how I should deal with this situation ahead of time. Your thoughts?
Wow.
It's a lot to unpack there.
It's a lot to unpack, but at the same time, it's very impressive. I'm actually going to turn off my earpiece because the echo is getting to me, but and just answer in the mic. So if you ask me a question, I won't hear for a minute.
Well, I guess you can't see us right now either, huh?
Yeah.
Well, I can pull you up. Let's see.
Okay.
Okay, it's just, I'm getting the loud echo that sounds like it's in the room with you, but okay.
I'm sorry, don't know what's wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. Several things that he said indicate that he's in just about an ideal situation, frankly. First of all, his wife respects his views. That's fantastic. That's not the case for a lot of people. Secondly, he's coming from a Jewish perspective. It's in the Jewish religion, humanistic Judaism, atheistic, essentially, Jewish culture, is accepted to the point that it's actually now one of the 5 branches of Judaism. It is an official branch of the religion. So unlike a lot of other religious situations, he's actually in a position, in a community, that at least has some ability to process the presence of someone who is non-theistic among them. It's actually woven into the religion. So that's good. Now, his children are going to a Jewish school. There's a lot of variability depending on whether it's an Orthodox school, whether it is a Reformed Jewish school, and so on. But the situation that he's in is All he needs to do, and all I recommend for parents who are in this situation, and some who are even who are not in quite as good a situation, if the child hears two clearly articulated opinions in terms of worldview, and if those two opinions are held in mutual respect, not the opinions themselves, but the right of the two people to hold them, that is an incredibly powerful situation for the child to be in. So you've got the wife who is still practicing theistic Jew, and you have a husband who is a non-theistic cultural Jew. The child sees the two people respecting each other, even as they differ profoundly in their actual beliefs. That is a child who's in an ideal situation. They have the invitation from both sides to think for themselves, and they have the articulated worldview of one person and another. If the child sees at least two worldviews articulated in that way, then they realize, I see, it's a choice. This is something that I get to work out for myself. And you don't have to do anything magic. You don't have to do anything special. I think the idea of waiting until the child brings it up themselves or it comes up naturally is perfectly good. If there's another situation where the child seems troubled or is, grappling with something that he or she heard at school, that's another time you can step in. But really, it sounds to me like this situation is pretty close to ideal. I actually, frankly, worry a little bit when sometimes parents are in a situation where they both have the same perspective, whether it's religious or non-religious. Then you actually have to go outside of the home to give them that breadth of exposure to ideas. But in this case, he's actually got it built in, so I really think it's a good situation.
Okay.
Yeah. I was just going to comment that, in this email, the guy talks about his children being pretty young. And I think one of the things that we have to be cautious about is expecting children to be able to do too much too soon. And so, a 4-year-old isn't necessarily in a position to tell whether something is real or imaginary. And you can, you can start that game with them and help guide them on that path where they're dealing with reality and trying to make those judgments. But, if the kid consistently thinks that, SpongeBob is real and the Polar Express is real and stuff like that, at that age, that's not a big deal. That's nothing to get excited about.
Absolutely normal, right?
Yeah. So you just keep having those conversations. And the one thing I always advocate, especially when parents say, "Hey, my kid is getting exposed to religious ideas at school. He's getting exposed through family members or whatever," and I always advise parents to take control of that conversation by deliberately exposing the child to different religious thoughts. And I started my son with Greek and Roman mythology as a way of starting the inoculation process.
Perfect. And that's the right word, too. I really think that's an ideal word.
Yeah.
I can't help thinking that as atheists we have kind of an advantage over Christian parents because, skepticism is our friend. Yeah. I've heard Todd Friel on the Way of the Master radio show go into a rant about what a bad thing Veggie Tales has been for Christianity because it's sort of an animated show that talks about Bible stories. And then he says, well, when kids get older and they realize that Veggie Tales isn't real, they say, well, what about all these other Bible stories I've been told? Maybe they're not real. And I feel like, well, that's a built-in problem to trying to indoctrinate a kid with something that has no evidence. Whereas,
that brings up a very important point. A lot of times I hear parents talk about the concerns that their children are going to be indoctrinated. It's a very real concern, but it's actually much harder to indoctrinate a child than to raise a free-thinking child. It is, and it's increasingly difficult for just the reason you're talking about. You have all these different ideas, all these different inputs, this wild cultural melee of ideas that we've got, and you've got the internet, as the kids get older. It is very difficult now for a parent to build the kind of glass wall not glass, brick wall that you need to build around a child to achieve indoctrination. So I think just what you're talking about, the fact that this show can cast religious stories in a different light or something like that, those are very powerful moments, and it's one of the many, many things that makes it harder to indoctrinate a child now than it ever has been before.
Right. So would you say, in your experience, if you've got a religious parent and an atheist parent, as long as they approach it like in a non-competitive way, the atheist parent is more likely to win? I just contradicted myself, but
the thing I recommend is to not think about it in those terms. The win for me is the child who makes his or her own decision. That's the win. Mm-hmm. Now, whether that child's going to end up being secular or not, I really have to free myself to say, okay, here's the thing with my kids, for example. Mm-hmm. I raised my kids to be honest. I raised my kids to be curious and to value the truth and to find the world wonderful, no matter whether God exists or God doesn't exist. I've raised them to be empathetic to others. I've raised them to be tolerant. All these things are the basic values in which we've raised them. Now, whether they choose a secular perspective or a religious one, I'm confident that they're going to choose one that embodies those values. Mm-hmm. So the fact is, if my child comes to me and says, hey, Dad, I've decided I'm a liberal Quaker, hey, Dad, I've decided I'm a Congregationalist or something like that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think those are much more likely outcomes because that's a reflection of the values in which they were raised. If my child came to me and said, hey, guess what? I've decided I'm a snake-handling Pentecostal. It could happen, but it would be flipping the values in which they were raised entirely on their head. It's a much less likely outcome. And so, at some point we have to say the more important thing to me is the process, is an honest process, not a specific outcome that matches mine.
I do have a counterexample for you. You know about Madalyn Murray O'Hair's son?
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, I don't know much about how Madalyn raised her child.
Yeah, his name, by the way, was William J. Murray, and I forget what he converted to, but he became a pretty hardcore public theist, I think, as a reaction.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, here's what I think happens. I don't know about her specific situation, but if an atheist parent raises the child with a very sort of doctrinaire atheism, if they make it clear to the child that you're going to end up like me or I won't respect you, you're going to end up like me or, I'm going to disown you or anything like that. In other words, if we behave like a fundamentalist Christian, the odds are that our child can do exactly the same thing that the children of fundamentalist Christians often do. Go completely to the other end of the spectrum to oppose the parent. Yeah. So it's possible, I don't know the situation with Madalyn's family, but it is possible that the child at least felt that they were put in that kind of a situation and then they rebelled against the parental authority. I've seen this over and over again when I meet parents at a conference or something and they say, my daughter was raised an atheist from the beginning. We never allowed her to see any religious ideas, talk to any religious people or anything. We let her know from the beginning that religion is stupid. And then she turned 16 and now she's a door-knocking evangelist. What in the world happened? And my feeling is that you set yourself up for that when you make it too clear that you're giving them a choice to rebel.
Right. I always
setting. What's that?
I always feel like it's not a possibility that kids will rebel when they turn into their teenage years. It's a guarantee.
That's right.
So if your only reason for the things that you want them to do is because I said so, that guarantee is going to mean that they're going to turn away from you or what you taught them. Whereas if you give them, if you basically instill them with the values and the understanding of why they would behave one way instead of another, they can only rebel against you so far before butting up against things that they actually believe themselves.
Well, see, you got it exactly right, I think. If you give them the opportunity to build their own foundation, the foundation of worldview that they're standing on, then, just as you said, they are not as likely to rebel against something they've built themselves. So you give them the process, you give them the opportunity, you keep space around them so that they can think for themselves. And then in the end, you got it exactly right, they're going to own it. It's not going to be something that they can push against.
Right.
Well, and getting back to what you said about not insulating them from other religious ideas, one of the things I think that, as I look back on my own childhood and my own, journey to reason, I think about the fact that I was exposed to mostly just Christianity, a little bit of Judaism, but mostly just Christianity. But it was all different flavors of Christianity, everything from, Pentecostal, Assembly of God, speaking in tongues, falling down, slain in the spirit kind of things, all the way through very liberal Episcopalians. And I think about that, and it's like what that did was it exposed the fact that Christians don't even agree on their own theology. There are so many different disagreements, and I know that right now there are lots of Christians who probably, they'll hear this, or maybe they've heard me talk about this before, and they'll say, "Oh, that's why you're an atheist. You weren't exposed to a consistent message." And I would say that's exactly right. That was one of the big contributors there. That there was no consistent message through that, and I think it's important for kids who are being raised as free thinkers to see this. If you go and talk to Christians or Muslims or anything, and they tell you, "Oh, this is the one true path," you're going to talk to somebody else who lays claim to the same label, and they're going to have a different true path for you.
Yeah, that's a very powerful realization. The one thing that I have said I don't want my kids exposed to, at least not exposed to it until I can sort of prepare them for it, is fear.
Right.
I don't want, I wanted to be sure that we had talked about hell before they heard it on the playground when they're 6 years old, which is, if you talk to parents, one after another, kids hear about hell when they're 6. That's the age it typically happens, when they're in kindergarten or, early first grade, and a peer finds out that they don't go to church.
Yeah.
In a conversation, and they say, "Oh my gosh, you're going to hell." Well, what is hell? Well, hell is this place where you're going to burn forever because you don't believe in God, and so on. I didn't want my kids to hear that first from someone else.
Yeah.
So we talked about the idea of hell, and we defused it completely. I don't play fair with hell. It's the one religious idea where I don't play fair. I laugh it to scorn, and I tell them, if God exists, God thinks it's a silly idea too.
Yeah.
It's just completely human. It's insulting. Could you imagine being God and saying, I'm going to burn them forever because they didn't believe in me? That's just too egotistical. So I always told my kids to picture God thumping himself on the forehead, face palm, and saying, "How did they come up with this stuff?" That's the one thing that I treated unfairly and got out of the way. And as a result, when my daughter, I remember my oldest daughter, when she heard it on the playground, 3 friends at once all gasped and said she was going to hell when they found out she didn't go to church. And she was able to tell me the story and say, "Well, that's silly." She was able to be very dismissive of it, which is what I wanted. It's the one religious idea I don't play fair with.
Yeah, and I have to agree with that. And it's interesting because my son is 7 now, and I think this whole idea of hell has kind of bounced off of him. And, if you asked him if he even gave you an answer, he'd probably look at you like you were crazy. But if he even gave you an answer, he would probably tell you, "Oh, that's that thing my mom says sometimes when she steps on my Legos," among other things.
Yeah.
So getting back to something you said earlier, I know a lot of parents are afraid that if they talk about religion that they don't believe in at all, like let's say they're not in a mixed household, but you've got 2 atheists who agree with each other, and they're sometimes paralyzed by the idea that they're going to be unfair to everything, and so they don't talk about atheism at all.
Right.
That's not such a good idea, right?
Oh gosh, no, it's not at all. But it is a concern. I think they actually have the right concern. It's just that it's the wrong thing to do to just turn it off completely. I was in When my wife and I got married, she was religious. She was Baptist by descent, her entire family, and I guess Presbyterian was the church she was primarily going to at the time, but she was definitely Christian. And for the first 13 years of our marriage, she considered herself Christian. Well, and she was always from the beginning just a very intelligent, liberal, not fundamentalist, not literalist or anything like that. So we worked things out very, very well with the kids and all. I actually thought it was an advantage. Here we've got, like I said, with the Jewish couple, here we've got the diversity built into the home. And both of us respect each other so that we were able to very safely say, hey, here's what I believe, but you should talk to Mom because I know she believes differently, and send the kids, to get these two different voices. Perfect. Well, about 7 years ago, she decided she was a secular humanist. Well, that's lovely. But the funny thing is, the second thought I had is, we just kind of lost that diversity in the home. So we actually had at that point, we were a little more vigilant of making sure that we got the kids outside of the home, got them out to hear other voices, talk to grandma, go to church once in a while, go to a Sikh Gurdwara, go to a Hindu temple, get those experiences outside of the home, because we had lost the built-in diversity a little bit. So that's what I recommend. You own what you are. You make it absolutely clear that the choice is theirs, and then you get them to hear other voices as well.
Cool. Couldn't agree more. So Atheism for Dummies, what's up with that?
That was a ball to write. That was the most fun I've had on a writing project. Really, it was the company that does the Dummies books, Wiley.
Oh, this is, okay. I guess it didn't connect for me for a minute that this is actually an official for Dummies book.
This is an official, yes. This
All
is
right.
an official Dummies book.
Very cool.
Yeah. So they decided that the time had come culturally for there to be a book called Atheism for Dummies. And they actually went to some prominent bloggers, including Hemant Mehta, and asked for recommendations for who would be the person to write this. And I was grateful to say that he suggested me. But what they do in the Dummy series is, for these cultural topics, they want to see that something's hot. And atheism is hot. It's something that people are talking about now.
Yes.
So they decided that it's finally time to have a book that introduces the layperson to atheism. And first of all, I was stunned that it didn't already exist. I couldn't believe it. 1,600 books in the Dummies series. Yeah, there are books on digital photography and gardening and philosophy and religion generally, and several different denominations: Catholicism for Dummies, Mormonism for Dummies, the Bible for Dummies.
A lot of computer programming stuff. I know that firsthand.
Oh gosh, yes, lots of that.
Yeah.
There's a book called Farmville for Dummies.
Wow.
Isn't that redundant?
Yeah.
No, sorry.
But my favorite one, the weirdest one I found, there's a book called eBay for Canadians for Dummies. And that was more compelling than atheism, apparently. That had to be written before the book on the worldview that 1 billion people hold, worldwide.
Right.
So anyway, it was time, and they gave the project to me, and I just had a ball writing it.
So is this book targeted more at people who are atheists, or more at responding to people who just don't know anything about it?
This is the Dummy series is very clear about who their audience is. First of all, not dummies. They make that clear. These are people who just want to know more about a topic they don't know much about. But this was very specifically for lay people who don't know much about atheism, but they've heard about this thing and it sounds interesting. It was not intended to convince. It's intended to describe. Here's what atheism is. Here's our history. Here's our literature. And for that reason, I think it really ends up filling a gap in the literature. This is the book you can give to your Aunt Mildred, who thinks you're crazy, who doesn't know what this atheism thing is about. That's the audience I had in mind. It was your Aunt Mildred.
So I guess your primary audience is expected to be mostly religious.
Mostly either religious, or in some cases it will be that big fuzzy spiritual but not religious, or it could be somebody who's non-religious but doesn't use the word atheist. And frankly, one of the nicest things is I've now heard from many scores and scores of atheists who picked up the book and said, this is great, I didn't know this stuff about atheism. A year and a half of research went into this and another book that I did right before it. And so it has an awful lot about atheism that a lot of atheists won't know.
Tell me something I don't know.
Okay, tell you something I don't know. Did you know that Mexico once had an out atheist president?
No.
Wow.
That's something I didn't know. In the 1920s,
impressive.
Plutarco Caius was an out atheist. Did you know that Quebec used to be the most religious province in Canada, 83% Catholic, and it is now the least religious province in Canada by almost every measure, and still 83% Catholic.
Wow, Quebec, that's where our good friend Dennis Marcuse lives.
Yeah.
You've probably run into him before.
Oh, gosh. Yes.
Well, that is really interesting.
Yeah.
Jen? Any questions?
No, I think I'm good right now.
Okay. Dale, is there anything else you'd like to tell us, or should we switch over to other callers?
That's fine. We can go to callers.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. And so your three books are Atheism for Dummies, Parenting Beyond Belief, and
Raising Freethinkers.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. I've enjoyed having you on.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.